Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this week's episode of Let's Talk About Work on LinkedIn Live. And I am so honored today to host someone that I met by chance. I think late last year, maybe it was early this year. My months are kind of running together. We had the opportunity to sit on a panel together. I was so impressed by her, and we had so much synergy. We could just talk forever. So I said, you know what? Hopefully, she will do me the favor of joining me on my show so that we can continue our conversation. So, everyone, put your hands together, although we can't see you or hear you, but put your hands together and welcome Nicole Herrera. Am I saying that right? Want to make sure.
Herrera, yes.
Edwina, yes. I felt like it was more to it than what I was saying. To LinkedIn Live, Nicole is the diversity and inclusion lead at Google. And as we know, Google is one of the most admired companies across the globe. They're doing so much when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I'm so excited for the next 30 minutes or so. We're going to get a sneak peek to the behind the scenes of how Nicole and her team helps to create such a inclusive environment at Google. So, Nicole, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here with you today, Natasha. Thank you for the invitation. And I am excited to dive right in headfirst to this conversation. As you mentioned, we had a ton of synergy all the times that we've chatted before. And so I hope that everyone that's tuning in today is able to engage with the content and hopefully learn something new as a takeaway for remembering that this work isn't just for those of us that work in diversity and inclusion. It's really everybody's responsibility to contribute towards building an inclusive environment in the workspace. So hopefully you have your notepads out and are taking notes, ready to go back to work and put some of this stuff to good use.
That's right. And that's what we want you to do. When we're doing good work at our work, we want other employees, not just the employees that work at our organizations, to feel that inclusive environment, but we have the same thought process. We want everyone, no matter where you work, to walk in and feel that sense of belonging and inclusion. So you're absolutely correct. Before we dig in to the work that you're doing at Google, I'm interested to hear, and I'm sure that the viewers are too. Tell us your journey to becoming the head of inclusion and diversity at Google.
Yes, that's a good question. I think this is still probably considered a fairly new space and industry for people. So I think it's really important for each of us that work in this space to just be really transparent about our own backgrounds to help debunk any myths that might be out there for people who are really passionate about this work and like looking to get into this space. So my background is actually in Latin American studies. So I majored in Latin American studies in undergrad, which is actually a very useful degree for the work that I'm in right now. But I originally thought that I wanted to go into kind of international business. And so the first half of my career journey was in Latin America and in sales. So very different, but definitely some transferable skills to diversity and inclusion work, because in sales, you learn about tailoring content to the right audience and making, a pitch with all the business justification and thinking through the long-term impact of whatever it is that you're trying to sell to people. So there was definitely a lot of relevant learnings in there for me. And then when I really started to get more involved in this space, I'd say when I got involved in Google's employee resource group for Latinx employees, it's called HOLA. And I started to get more and more involved there, eventually served on the global board for that employee resource group, which you can imagine is pretty big at a company like Google. So we do that as what we call 20% projects at Google. So it's kind of like 20% of your time goes to something that's not your full-time job. But I say anybody who's out there doing that work, especially at a big company, it's the equivalent of running a business, because there's a huge structure that you're overseeing and making sure that everybody's driving and aligning on the same goals. And so the more and more I got involved there, I kind of started to see everything happening behind the scenes, behind the curtains. And it was kind of unavoidable to me at that point. Like the writing was on the wall, like I needed to be doing this full time.
Wow.
And my first role kind of in this space when I started to transition was more focused on the external community. So I helped found a program that's called the Google Digital Coaches Program. It still exists. So if you are a Black or Latinx small business owner out there, you should definitely check out the Google Digital Coaches Program. We have coaches. Yes, we have coaches in a lot of different cities. Obviously, right now, most of the programming is virtual, but they provide a lot of training and help business owners create an online presence and get access to a bunch of tools that Google has to make sure that you're building an online presence, which, as we know, is often a gap in our communities. And it's a critical component to surviving as a business owner, especially in these times right now, being able to pivot your business to run online. So that was like my first full-time job in this space. I say that it's kind of a version of product inclusion, making sure that Google's products for small business owners were equally accessible to communities that we know are often underrepresented and have challenges to access. And now I've transitioned to be more focused on our internal audiences and looking after our strategy there. So that's a bit about my journey.
Oh, wow. So interesting. I'm going to take advantage of a couple of things that you have just, that you just talked about. I even noticed the other day, like, you know what? My actual business is not on Google. Like my website is, but my business is not, like recognized on Google. That's like, I got to set up my business. And so I don't know how to do that. And so there you go. You just gave me a tool and a resource to have that presence. And, you talked about, a very good point in these days. It used to be you could start a business by, I went and got a law degree, and I thought, with my degree and my credibility, I can start a business. And, no, it's more so about your digital presence and content creation almost than anything else. So that's so important to understand those, rules, those resources and tools that are available to you. And Tanya, it's called Google. Will you say that again? We've getting a couple of questions. What's it called again? The coaching resource?
Google Digital Coaches.
Google Digital Coaches. Like she said, bring out that pad and pen. Already dropping some things. So just write that down because that's your first thing you're going to take away. You brought up another point that I really want to talk about because I've heard a lot about this. And, you said you started an ERG, but Google gives you 20%, allows you to devote 20% of your time to do that, right? So if you're an FTE, FTE, then 20% of that goes to that time of doing that. I've often heard many organizations or people complaining, if you will, saying that they're asked to lead ERGs, but they're not given the time to do it. So they're actually committing additional time in addition to their, committing 100% of their work. It's an additional time that they're not getting paid for, it's like a whole nother job. But it seems like that structure is a little different at Google, where it's considered part of your job and you don't feel like, oh, I've got to do this, this, and this, and then on top of which volunteer my time. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. So 20% projects are like a very big part of the culture at Google. And I think it's been really important in my career, right? Because that was kind of my first experience on paper to start to build my resume in a direction that I was more passionate about for DEI. And at the end of the day, that counted towards experience that I could put on that resume to eventually go up for roles like the role that I have right now. I think a lot of companies are still kind of figuring it out for the ERG level. I think having that messaging around like it's okay to take time out of your full-time job to do this is important. I think creating standardized systems where it will also be recognized in performance reviews is also super critical, because it's one thing to say, okay, you can go work on this, but then if it comes time for your annual performance review and your manager's like, yeah, I know you worked on it and I'm still okay with you continuing to work on it, but like don't include the projects or the scope that you were working on in your performance review, then that's where we start to run into problems, right? And bias, because you're leaving it up to individual managers to kind of like make the decision on, is this worthwhile? Is this considered impactful work? And then managers who don't have subject matter expertise in this space, right, bring their own bias to that as well. And kind of how they're used to looking at impact in your day-to-day job, whatever that might be, doesn't necessarily apply to what impact looks like in leading an ERG, which is like that leadership skill set that you're working on and all of those things. So
like you said, it's like being a CEO, you really are running all kind of components, of it, so yeah, that's a great opportunity.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people see it through that lens as an opportunity to demonstrate your leadership skills, to demonstrate leading a team, a project, and using those transferable skills. I mean, I've never even thought about it in that capacity. So that's something else for people to write down. You're looking to get into the DEI space, and you don't have the opportunity in a formal way. Start and lead an ERG group, right? And look around your organization, assess what's needed, and do that. And there you go. You've got, a way to show your leadership capabilities, your project management, et cetera, et cetera. So that's fantastic.
Exactly.
So in your current role, let's talk about that a little bit more. I know you talked about, you did a lot, external, things like that, your backgrounds in sales or whatever. What does your day-to-day look like in your current position?
So currently I support a product team that's called Platforms and Ecosystems at Google. And so we cover a large portfolio of our products, including Google Play, Google Chrome, Android. So it's a pretty big business. And like I said, I'm focused on like the internal side. And then I lead what's called our inclusive culture pillar for that business. And so looking at a bunch of different programs that contribute to kind of our North Star goals around inclusive culture, which are obviously around improving inclusion and belonging for Google employees. So we have a lot of goals around that, and there's a lot of different programs. Right now, something that I think is top of mind for everybody, especially in this busy first quarter of the year, are a lot of what we consider kind of the big months that happen throughout the year. So we're in Black History Month right now. We're coming up on Women's History Month and International Women's Day on March 8th. And so I know that a lot of companies tend to rally resources and programming around these moments throughout the year. And it's one of the things that I'm thinking about right now in terms of just how do we set up teams to kind of do on their own and start to activate more and have more of like a bottoms up approach to these things versus waiting on one person or one resource to kind of produce a bunch of content around it. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you, if you looked at the current culture of inclusion, what are some of those things? And I agree, as we celebrate Black History Month, we're going into Women's History Month, et cetera, et cetera. I see a huge gap there. I think that a lot of it is performative. I think a lot of it is not impactful. And really, you miss an opportunity. I wrote an article about it, and put it like an acronym to it. Race, recognize, appreciate, do all these things to try to help guide organizations to make their cultural appreciation months more impactful. But like you said, what I hear, and have seen is that a lot of times it's on one person. They'll just say, oh, hey, you go, plan the Black History Month. And therefore, that's why it seems like this kind of rushed event and almost repetitive. I know in some organizations we talk about for all different months, the same people, the same accomplishments, the same oppression, et cetera, and not really taking the time to give a full breath of what that month means to that particular culture.
Yeah, definitely. I 100% agree with you. I think there's a lot of do's and don'ts that we can start chatting about with these months. You use a word that's very much a buzzword right now, which is performative. And I think the kind of big piece behind that and the driver is people's motivations for how they're showing up to this work. And I think a big missing component oftentimes in DEI work is the reflection time and the real time to reflect and like learn, because we're treating things like a check the box, show up to this event, went to this thing. Okay, this was what my contribution was. And so if you're not evolving in the way that you're learning and like reflecting on how you're showing up and what your motivations are, that's likely not going to change. It's kind of just going to stay status quo. And so you kind of see a combination of things. One is people feel really uncomfortable still in this space. There's this heightened sense of like, oh my gosh, I don't want to make a mistake. What do I know? So I'm so uncomfortable. I'm either going to like do nothing or wait for the token person from said community to just do everything for me. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, you get people who have like this huge sense of urgency, like, oh my gosh, we have to do everything. It has to be perfect, like output. And both of those are what I say are like the wrong motivators for showing up in this space. And you're likely not going to get something that's successful or impactful in any type of way. And you're probably going to cause some harm along the way of doing that.
Exactly. These unintended consequences, upon embarking on it. We've got two great questions. I love that they're asking the questions for me. I have a lot, but I love that it's coming in. So Leroy asks, what is your biggest challenge as it relates to getting people motivated to look at this? And I'm assuming that he means the work around inclusion, diversity, etc., as more than just a program, than a process.
That's such a good question. Very loaded. There's like a lot of pieces in there.
What will be your biggest, challenge, I guess?
Yeah, I'm going to tackle the first part of the question, which is what's the biggest challenge as it relates to getting people motivated to like do more in this space. I'd say that my biggest challenge right now as somebody who does work full time is finding the balance between over hand-holding individuals versus creating a system and a program that really is going to let them learn and own as they go along. So when you're thinking about even just like from a program management standpoint, okay, what are the resources I need to put together? Like what is a playbook or a guide or a this going to look like to send to teams so that they start saying, okay, this is something I can do. So how much of that is like holding people's hand along the way versus allowing for some of that reflection and self-learning that I'm talking about? That is what I would say is one of the biggest challenges that I'm dealing with right now and thinking about. And then the second part of the question is to look at this as more than just a program, but a process and a system.
Just do unconscious bias training. Done. That's just
Yes, I would say that is a challenge all of us experience. I'm sure that you deal with the same thing, right? They're bringing you in to speak on this one topic, and then like, where is it going to go from there? I think it's important to be building out a roadmap and thinking of things as like little chunks of progress along the way. And I also think it is important that you're focusing the types of events to be as engaging as possible, and like things that are really going to be having the discussion component and putting the ownership on managers to like follow up after we bring in a speaker. Let's have a discussion as a team. Like what were the top learnings that we got out of that, and keep checking in on it, right? This is what I learned as a leader, and this is what I'm going to be implementing in my leadership style now that like I'm focusing on allyship or whatever it may be. I think that is going to be an important component to anyone who's looking to move beyond just a one-time thing.
That's great. That's great. And then I had another question that kind of goes back to the ERGs, and it is, what are some ways that Google activates their ERGs throughout the year when they may not be in, their month, so Black History Month, February. How do we continue, engagement with ERGs in May, in June, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a great question as well. And I think most companies have a lot of room to improve here still. I would say that at Google, we have a lot of projects going on that do relate back to what I was mentioning earlier, that product inclusion side of things. So looking at what aspects of our products can we be improving to be more inclusive to any given demographic or community. And that is definitely something that's an ongoing effort throughout the year. What other ways? I'm trying to think of in terms of like engaging. I guess like company-wide, we do celebrate like speakers and other content throughout the year that's not necessarily just in that 1 month as well. And we have a lot of representative leadership groups within the company that do a really good job of championing that work as well.
Okay, great. I want to talk about, can you believe we're almost like 9 minutes out?
No.
I knew it, I want to talk about the Latinx community in the workplace right now. I feel like I don't hear enough about the accomplishments and the challenges that people within the Latinx community are facing right now in the workplace. And what does inclusion look like? We've been talking a whole lot about a Black experience, especially after the murder of George Floyd. We've been talking a lot about AAPI, lately, but what does from a Latinx perspective, and it oftentimes is grouped together. You'll hear Black and brown employees, and I always say, well, there's a little bifurcation there. That's not necessarily the same experience, and maybe it shouldn't be grouped together like we often do. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe I'm wrong. I want to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I agree with that fully. I think the number one piece of inclusion is often counterintuitive to the way people think about inclusion. It's actually focused on hiring and representation. So I think the biggest component to making people feel included and represented is hiring more people that look like them. Because if not, you have a lot of people that are literally the only one that looks like them on their team and in the room, whether that's virtual or in person. And I've definitely experienced that multiple times throughout my career. Even in doing DEI work, I am often the only Latina voice in the room. Wow. And I'm sure that you can relate to that as well.
And that's why I'm always like, no, it's different. Yep.
And so even within our bubble, where the assumption is people are much farther along on their learning, et cetera, we often see a lot of tokenism happening and inequitable distribution of work when it comes to certain topics, depending on the makeup of the DEI team and who is leading programming. If you don't have anyone else that's representing that community, it's going to keep falling oftentimes on that person. So I would say that is the number one component. And then kind of the next layer to that is the career and progression opportunities. If you don't have internal mobility opportunities, if you don't have clear paths for people of color where they know how they're going to be moving forward, that's literally telling them that they don't belong at your company. It's not just how you treat me in a meeting. And if you don't have racial slurs, it's like if I keep being the one that gets passed up for promotion or rejected again and again from other internal mobility opportunities, then you're telling me that this isn't a place where I can be successful, right? So I think those are oftentimes divided out into like separate divisions or topics or things, but they're very tied to how people feel in the day-to-day. And then I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done at the leadership and manager level, just in terms of understanding the Latinx community, I think there's still a lot of misconceptions and bias, which we see across all of the underrepresented groups, but there's especially a lot of nuance within the Latinx community, everything from like language to the immigrant experience versus the US born experience, the Latina experience and machismo and within our own community, and how that often makes women in particular not always feel the most included even within our own community. There's so many different topics there. So I think,
but I don't think they're talked about enough. I honestly don't hear these conversations as I do my DEI work. And as I, learn from others. I mean, you're bringing up things that are just not talked about. And I think that's, this is a part of work that often, like I said, you're grouped with the Black experience, but you've named many things that's not the Black experience. And we need to bifurcate that, right?
Yes.
Going forward.
I totally agree with you. And I think part of that is we often see more division than unity. Things like even the term Latinx is like,
I don't know what term to use sometimes. I have no idea. I just want to get corrected and then I use it.
And so things like that, I'm sure there's people who are listening right here who don't self-identify with that term, who hate that term or have, their own feelings about that term. And so what that ends up doing, and I know this happens in the Black community as well, it's like we get so caught up in these things that it's like starts creating division within the community, which is completely not the point of why we're here trying to do this work and move stuff forward. And it's exactly what the system wants to have happen.
Exactly. You get so distracted with these little things, like you said, in the Black community. Am I Black? Am I African American? All that. Am I that? It's these terms and it's your preference, and you get caught up in it. And I even heard so much conversation in the Black community about whether or not Jewish people were as oppressed as Black people. Now, I'm like, look, we've got to just tackle oppression, historical oppression, current oppression, and not do the comparing and the this and the that, and figure out ways we can move forward together so that the people that come behind us don't experience any type of oppression, no matter what you label them as. I mean, that's just the way that I see it. That may be controversial, but that's the way I see it. Eliminate oppression altogether.
Exactly. It's because the system has taught us to have this scarcity mindset, which we talk a lot about in social justice work and in DEI work, is like, we're so used to coming from a place of scarcity because our whole lives, that's kind of how the system has treated a lot of us. And so it's hard to shift your mindset to, okay, fighting for my slice of the pie to get bigger, to no, the whole pie needs to get bigger. And these aren't outlying cases. It's if you're solving for something that is making somebody feel harmed, left out, or excluded, it's only going to help the experience for everyone. And shifting like mindsets more into that direction.
Absolutely. Well, look, I can't believe it. Our time is up. In fact, somebody says, I know our time is up, but I feel I did want to talk about that. Can you give me 5 more minutes?
Of course.
Okay. Because thank you, Kelly. This was definitely something I wanted to hear about because as you know, I have become over the past year a huge mental health advocate, and including that in DEI work.
Yes.
And I am interested to see what Google is doing in terms of promoting mental wellness and other disabilities, whether it's mental disability, physical disabilities, as part of your work. Thank you, Kelly. I was like, should I ask? But now that you asked, I was like, we got to go over 5 minutes. Okay.
Yes. Thank you for that question, Kelly. Disability is definitely a part of the DEI conversation at Google. And back to the topic of product inclusion that I know I keep talking about. And I think it's going to be the future of what DEI work looks like, not even just at tech companies, but at any company, and what their product ends up being, and making sure that it's inclusive. Accessibility is a huge component of that. And so we know that we have huge global audiences and user groups that have a number of potential different disabilities, and we need to be creating products with that in mind and making sure that they're accessible to that user base. So it's definitely something that's been top of mind for a really long time at Google. Shifting gears a little bit into the mental health side of that, I think there's a lot of nuance there, particularly when we're talking about communities of color. And so I think it's so important that people like us share our stories and are as transparent and vulnerable as possible, because it's just such a taboo topic. The Latinx culture in particular, you know, a lot of people grow up in this mindset of like, you don't air your dirty laundry with anybody. You don't talk about what happens at home with anybody else. Your family is perfect. Your
perception of perfection. That's what I always say.
Your parents and your elders are nothing but to be respected. You know, your family dynamic just needs to be showing as perfect. And so it's really hard to overcome a lot of those things. And it can be especially triggering for people in the community who aren't having that experience, but seeing everybody around them, at least promoting that lens on the outside. It's like, what's wrong with me, or what's wrong with my family, that like that hasn't been what my experience is. And feeling like you don't have anyone to go to talk to about these things.
Even watching shows as a child, you would see white people like going to therapy and lay on the couch and talking about those things. You were like, oh, but we're not allowed. Like, I would never do that. You know, as you were growing up, it was just something that wasn't part of our community. It was something you kind of just saw on TV, you know?
Exactly. And then there's so many layers to this. Like access is a huge part of that because of the equation, like access to what that even means. Most people don't have access to that, have never heard of it except seeing it in a TV show and until you reach a certain level of wealth or income, right?
Even with insurance, you know, when I was going through my mental health crisis, even with good insurance, it was hard to find providers that either took insurance at all, or had availability, you know. So even if I had $500 an hour to pay, it was hard to find someone that was taking new patients. So that access issue was humongous.
And then bringing it back, you know, to the workplace, I think people of color, and particularly, you know, women of color, then you the whole next layer there is like the stereotypes, right? The stereotypes that we face that other people don't face, even, you know, white women don't necessarily face when they have a mental health issue that they're dealing with, versus us. It's like, okay, how is this going to affect my performance review? How is this going to affect people's perception of me? Am I going to now be known as the dramatic one, the angry one, the you name it, because I shared a little bit of like my mental health struggle or something that I'm dealing with, I think is another component of why people feel the need to stay silent on these topics. We feel silenced. And then when you do share, you often feel like you're not being heard because of these things, or that the cost is higher for you than to just be quiet. And so I know so many people are working on, you know, changing this. And I hope that we're building an environment right now where that won't have to be the case for generations that are coming after us, and it becomes really a forefront of the conversation in the workplace. But I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done at multiple layers to get us there.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you for staying on a few more minutes. You dropped some tremendous gems. I knew you would, and I knew we could have another hour. And hopefully this is not the last time we talk. I know it's not. We definitely have a connection. But I appreciate what you do. I always learn something new from you, from every conversation that I have with you. everyone follow Nicole. She's a wonderful person, as you see, gives great insights. So if you want to continue this conversation, follow her on LinkedIn, and you won't regret it. But this is the end of this week's episode of Let's Talk About Work. I'm so glad that so many of you joined. You listened, you learned. I hope you take back some of these things, if not all of them, to your organizations. I mean, this is really game-changing things. And most importantly, I hope you join me back next week when we can just grab a glass of wine, kick our feet up, and talk about work. All right, everyone. Have a great evening and a great rest of the week.